On behalf of the trustees of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our first program of the 1985-86 season. I know that no one's going to be disappointed. Councilor Jacobson has been with the State Department since 1966. He's a member of the Senior Foreign Service. He has been posted in Africa since in various assignments since 1974, starting with Mozambique. He has spent the last 10 years in assignments in South Africa, in Botswana, Namibia, Johannesburg. And at the present time, he's a member of the State Department's Working Group on South Africa. So we're fortunate to have with us tonight a gentleman who's been at the center of considerations of our policies towards South Africa, and a member of the State Department who has spent 10 intensive years of his career in that particular country. So to address the theme of South Africa and its impact upon African policy, we're pleased to have a friend of Ambassador Lewis's, Councilor William Jacobson. Ambassador Jacobson.
I remember back in 1959 when I was fresh out of college in Seattle, Washington, and I ran into a family of friends of my wife's. Actually, she was to become my wife at the time, and they had a son who had just spent a year in South Africa as an exchange student. And I had opportunity to meet this young fellow after he returned from South Africa, and he was going to tell me about the complexities of the situation in South Africa. And I remember very clearly, I dismissed this fellow. Complexities of the situation in South Africa? Seemed to me it was pretty simple, black versus white, oppression versus justice. And I thought he was brainwashed, and frankly, I wasn't very concerned about what he tried to tell me. 21 years later, I returned from South Africa, having spent 2.5 years there on assignment in Joburg. And when I went out to groups such as this and I tried to talk about the complexities of South Africa, I found a lot of people dismissed what I had to say offhand with the same attitude that I had taken some 20 years before. What do you mean, complex? The issues are very clear. Well, I would submit that the issues are complex. They're difficult. As we know in the United States today, they're the source of continued interest on the part of the media, on the part of public opinion, certainly in our Congress. And our policies are tortured. They are under a great deal of scrutiny right now, for the first time really since this administration took office. And I'm going to be speaking for them tonight, but I recognize that South Africa is a really emotional subject. I will try not to get too emotional, but I recognize that this is an extremely emotional subject. And if you want to get emotional, why, feel free. Dr. Burke has told me that you usually have full houses here, and I think I discovered the reason for it. You have a space that accommodates 300, and you have 1,500 members. I think there are some lessons to be learned from that. As we've seen in 1985, South Africa has really exploded on the political stage in the United States. It's really remarkable what a year ago was really not an issue, which today is very much an issue. We turn on our TV sets for the evening news or the Ted Koppel show or Good Morning America, and we see scenes of black South Africans being beaten. We see scenes of armored cars, dogs, tear gas, batons being inflicted on people, injuries, deaths, and we cannot help but be moved. As opposed to a little more than a year ago, our newspapers are flooded with newspaper articles and commentaries on South Africa. In your own Baltimore Sun, I believe yesterday you had a very interesting article by a newspaperman from this city who's gone to South Africa to see for himself and to report on events there. Within our Congress, as I said earlier, South Africa is very much an issue, and the United States policy toward that country, toward that region, is very much an issue. It seems to me the problem is, what is the situation in South Africa, and what is the United States government supposed to do about it? South Africa is really a unique place. It is the only place that I know of that institutionalizes injustice on the basis of racial discrimination. And that makes it completely contrary to everything we stand for. No American administration could be anything but totally opposed to apartheid. And I assure you, this administration is. Change must come to South Africa. This reflects not only for what we stand for, but it reflects public opinion in the United States, which in every poll is concerned and opposed to the status quo in South Africa. The U.S. government is also opposed to the status quo in South Africa. How do we approach dealing with the South Africans? Well, some would say, let's just get out of there. Let's wash our hands of it. Let's get American companies who are operating there to divest and leave. Let's bring our ambassador. Let's bring our ambassador home. Let's close our embassies. Let's close our consulates. Let's have nothing to do with that place. It's anathema to us. I know of no U.S. administration so far which believes we should do that. I've had the privilege of working for 3 American presidents in Southern Africa, and I would say that our foreign policy objectives in the region are fairly constant. First, we tried to get independence for Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. That was accomplished. Secondly, we've been working for an independent Namibia, which reaches independence with an internationally supervised election. In other words, a free election so that the government chosen would be representational, would be recognized in a process which we would judge to be impartial. Thirdly, under 3 presidents, we've thought that the continued presence of Cuban forces in Angola was a destabilizing element in the region, and under these 3 administrations, we have pushed for their removal. And finally, penultimately, we have thought that the disputes, the inter-country disputes between the countries in the region which have tended to end up in violent confrontations should be the subject of negotiations. And finally, we have wanted to see an end to apartheid, an end to institutionalized injustice within South Africa itself. We have tried to not be prescriptive. We know that what happens in South Africa has to be decided upon by the people who live there. So we have simply made suggestions. We have talked about dialogue between the government, and after all, these people do run that country, and the unenfranchised, the black population. We have suggested that the real black leaders be brought forward, and we believe that dialogue should begin with them. That is the first step. The tactics of this administration have been very different. Those of you who've followed Southern African policy know that during the Carter administration, the United States was very outspoken about the situation in South Africa. Many newspaper articles, many headlines, many speeches. This administration has chosen a different tactic. It has decided to try to rely on quiet diplomacy. Now, that is not to say that we have not spoken out about the forced removals of black populations who just happen to have lived for 3 generations or 200 years in so-called white areas. This doesn't mean that we have not objected publicly to continued bannings of some of the whites and blacks who have been forces for conciliation within the communities. This doesn't mean that detention without trial or without charge has not been brought to the South African government's attention, and we've spoken out about this. But for the most part, this has been carried out quietly, diplomatically, between the two governments. Now, I know that these discussions between the two governments have not always been harmonious, because I haven't been a principal actor, but I've been on the sidelines in some of them. And Dr. Chester Crocker, who's quite a mild-mannered man ordinarily, speaks very candidly and very frankly when he has to give the proper message to the South Africans, and they're sitting on the other side of the table. With this tactic, we have seen some progress in the sense that people in Southern Africa, more than ever before perhaps, are starting to talk to each other rather than engaging in shooting at each other. We felt that the Nkomati Accord signed between the South Africans and the Mozambicans, which we encouraged, was a step forward, because under that agreement, Mozambicans agreed to stop allowing their territory to be used for springboards for infiltration and violence within the Republic. At the same time, the South Africans promised, under that accord, to stop supporting the anti-Frelimo forces in Mozambique. We thought that was a step forward. Notice I used the past tense. We have tried very seriously to move forward on Namibia. That base is not covered yet. We have managed to get the South African Defense Force, for the most part, out of Angola. As you recall, they invaded Angola first in 1981. They finally left in 1985. Of course, they went back in 1985 as well. But for the most part, they are out. We have heard, you may have read today, that South Africans declared that their forces are out of Angola. There are continuing conversations between Angola and between the South Africans about resolving the issue of the continued presence of the Cubans and about bringing independence to Namibia. But these have not been completed yet. There have been setbacks recently, and I think we have to admit that. The raid by the South Africans into Botswana, where I just spent the last 2.5 years. A beautiful country just to the north of South Africa. One of the peaceful, democratic states with a responsible government that pays its bills and makes enough money each year to do so. A terrible event. We felt a real setback. They found some South African troops trying to destroy Gulf Oil's installations in northern Angola. This was a terrible setback. We were surprised. We were shocked. But perhaps one of the biggest events or non-events was the August 15th speech by the President, P.W. Botha. We expected announcements of meaningful reform in South Africa. When I say non-event, that's about what it was. It was a truculent, loud, aggressive, posturing presentation of old arguments, and it disappointed as many within South Africa as without. In order to make clear to the South African government that obviously our messages had not been getting through, they did not take seriously the fact that we were speaking of the need for reform, President Reagan issued an executive order 2 weeks ago. Under that order, certain sanctions are imposed on South Africa. We've committed ourselves to maintain a strong presence in South Africa, to support fair employment practices by U.S. firms, and to increase funds for U.S. scholarships and human rights activities for the black population. But we are prohibiting U.S. bank lending to the South African government unless these loans are to improve the welfare of South Africans. It bans computer sales to the military, to police, and to other security or apartheid supporting agencies. It prohibits nuclear commerce except for items needed for health and safety or for International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. It requires U.S. firms to adhere to progressive labor practices similar to the Sullivan Principles. And we said that we were going to consult with our partners to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to ban the sale of Krugerrands. Krugerrands, as you probably know, are these gold coins minted by the South Africans. We bought $500 million worth last year in the United States. We have consulted with our partners. We will be banning the sale of Krugerrands. Also, under this executive order, we are establishing an advisory committee to advise on South African developments. Additionally, we are banning any importation of South African arms. This executive order obviously, excuse me, it's very hot under these lights. This executive order obviously was in response to considerable pressure that had built up in the United States, in Congress and in public opinion, that we needed to make sure that the South Africans were getting our message. And by sending an executive order, the President made this a bipartisan move that could not be misinterpreted by the South Africans, who well might say, well, now that's Congress, and that's not really what the administration feels, and that's just part of the American government has 3 chambers, and this is one acting. When the President issued this executive order, South Africans knew it was a clear signal coming from what they think is a conservative president representing the United States. So we think it is a much more effective device. Now, this executive order is not aimed at destroying South Africa. It is aimed at telling the government with a clear voice that we think the time for words has passed, and now we'd like to see some action. Our leverage in South Africa is limited. We have about 250 American firms operating there. That's less than 20% of foreign investment in South Africa. It's about 1% of our total business exposure abroad. So it's not huge in percentage terms. It is significant, however, psychologically. When you have General Motors and Ford and Weight Watchers, Kentucky Fried Chicken, you have symbols of the United States there. So it does send a signal to the South Africans that we are there. Now, the American companies who are there, of the 250, some 169 are signatories to the Sullivan Principles. These are principles elaborated 7 years ago by Reverend Leon Sullivan, the black church leader from Philadelphia who sits on General Motors' board of directors. They call for basically fair labor practices, integration in eating, comfort, and work facilities in all throughout the American firm, equal and fair employment practice for all employees, equal pay for equal work. Now, those are very similar to what you might expect in the United States. But then also training programs for blacks in supervisory, administrative, clerical, and technical jobs, increasing the number of blacks in supervisory and management positions, and improving the quality of life for black employees outside the work environment, for example, in housing, in transport, schooling, recreation, and health. And to report on the progress of implementing these principles. And Reverend Sullivan has obtained the services of an accounting firm to which these companies report every year. Who knows what is going to happen to the future of South Africa? It could conciliate. It could negotiate its own future. On the other hand, it could become another Lebanon, with the various groups tearing apart the fabric of the nation. We believe that we have to be committed to use the limited leverage we have for positive change. And as you may have read in the newspaper over the last 2 weeks, our ambassador went back to South Africa with a mandate. And perhaps the emphasis has changed slightly, and you may have detected it, from quiet diplomacy to more active diplomacy. This is a change in style, but not substance. We are going to hang in there. And now I know you have some questions.
Well, for a very clear and direct statement of the administration's policy, we thank you. And I know indeed there are questions. One is, would you comment upon aspects of the United States' policy towards South Africa, other than those you've mentioned, such as those that might bolster the South African regime, and such as those that might support controversial forces like UNITA in South Africa? The last question, the third question, was would you comment on the situation if the black and white aspects were reversed? And your second question, I should be able to recall. The last one is the one that's most interesting. Yes.
Well, I remember the question about nuclear cooperation. It's not clear whether South Africa has an atomic bomb, but I think most experts believe if they don't, they could have one within 1 year. The question is what the United States is doing to help them. We long have been resistant to giving South Africa any nuclear technology because they are not signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As a matter of fact, in 1977, we refused, and we've continued to refuse, supplying enriched uranium to them because they refused to sign that treaty, which provides for international inspection and safeguards. As to the question about the Clark Amendment, I think perhaps that question ought to be addressed to Congress because I believe the Senate repealed the Clark Amendment. But I can tell you that we are not supporting UNITA. We are engaged in very serious discussions with the MPLA government in Angola. We have told them we are not supporting UNITA. We did not do it before the repeal. We are not doing it now. Was there another one?
If the populations were reversed and the majority were black and the minority white, would we take the same position? In short, is the United States policy racist?
Well, that question is somewhat speculative, but I think we did something similar to that in the American South, did we not? Where we did have a majority white population and a minority black population, and we fought to bring justice to our black population in the South. I recall in 1979 or 1977, we brought to South Africa a an editor of the Anniston, Alabama newspaper by the name of Brant Ayers, who's a real good old boy from the South. And he was attending a conference in South Africa, but we thought it would be a good idea if we got him around to speak to people, and I had the pleasure of programming him in a group of Afrikaners at the Afrikaner Chamber of Commerce in Johannesburg. And his message was very simple. He said, listen, South Africans, we've been through something similar in the American South. We had racial segregation as an albatross around our necks, and we couldn't think of anything else. We were obsessed with it. And those of you who've been in South Africa know how obsessed the South Africans are about race. So he said, as soon as we took measures in the 1960s to get this albatross off our necks, to integrate, to try to achieve understanding, to get this racial question put behind us and move forward, the American South progressed tremendously. Atlanta took off. The industrial belt moved from the northeast to the southeast, and we're so much better off, and we feel better about it. And one of these Afrikaners stood up and made one of these impassioned speeches and said, yeah, but it's different here. That was the American South, but in America the numbers are completely different. Here we're outnumbered by our black population, and you just can't compare the two. Well, I won't try to duplicate his accent, but Brant Ayers said, well, he said, when I was a little boy, my mama told me the story of a little boy who said, Mommy, I ain't going to do it. And his mama said, you have not been to the bathroom for 4 days, and you're going to take this castor oil. He said, Mommy, I ain't going to do it. You are going to do it. Mommy, I ain't going to do it. And finally, she took his mouth, and she opened it, and she poured that castor oil down his throat. And he said, all right, but I ain't going to do nothing. And all of the tension in that room evaporated, and everybody laughed because they could see the analogy.
The question was, the present administration's policy has been very proud of its emphasis upon restraint. And during your remarks, you made the point that that was in a specific instance, a good thing then and perhaps not so good now, or at least not in practice now.
I think we're in a period of reassessing that. We thought it was a good thing because we thought the countries would live up to it, and we think Samora Machel and Frelimo have lived up to it. And it's quite clear now with the South African government admitting that it has not lived up to it. We think that this has to be reassessed. Generally, we think that accords which reduce the level of violence are positive, and I think in principle we still believe that. Perhaps I should not have been so strong about that, but we are very concerned about these admissions of failure to live up to this, because we thought that this was something that was really promising, and now we're very concerned about it. I would say, however, that Samora Machel during his visit here has complained about the South African unwillingness to live up to their side of the bargain, but he's not called for an end to this accord. So Mozambique puts a lot, they have a lot invested in this. They understand that if this can work out, if it can be lived up to, if it can bring peace to the region, they have a lot to gain in terms of investment and assistance from South Africa.
That was the second question you had. That is, whether one can deal with South Africa in a rational fashion. And Professor Ryu's point, I think, was, has this South African failure to live up to their accords proven that one of the assumptions of American policy, namely that the South Africans could be trusted in negotiation, is perhaps a false assumption. So both questions point at the question of whether you have diminishing confidence in South Africa being able to respond in a trustworthy and rational fashion.
I think our actions speak for themselves in that regard. I think the executive order speaks to that.
Would you give us a specific definition to the phrase American presence in South Africa, which you used?
We believe that our companies can play a positive role. We believe that our ambassador can make it quite clear to the South Africans how we feel about things. You may have heard on the news tonight that we have agreed to accept the credentials of the designate of the South African government as a new ambassador in the United States, because we believe that as many channels of communication need to be open as possible. I would not think for 1 minute that this involves military at all. We have not had a naval ship visit to South Africa for over 20 years because we didn't like the way that our black sailors were treated when they landed there. We have not had military cooperation with the South Africans. We've had an arms embargo since 1963, long before the 1977 mandatory arms embargo with South Africa. So I certainly would not include military presence. But I do believe that more Americans ought to get involved. I think it's great that you sent a newspaper reporter from the Baltimore Sun to South Africa. I think it's good for universities and other institutions in the United States to build bridges with South African institutions. I think that we can, from the private sector as well as the public sector, do a lot. The United States government spends about $10 million a year in a program with human rights projects, with self-help community projects. We have a grant to the AFL-CIO to support labor training, to train black businessmen and labor leaders so that they can be more effective in their setting. We have an $18 million program over the next 5 years to bring disadvantaged students to the United States to study here. And we also have a program within South Africa itself to help people who could not study ordinarily to get the degrees so that they can play a role in the future South Africa. That's what I mean by presence.
There are two questions. One is, why does the United States use the word freedom fighters to describe those people who are resisting the government in Nicaragua, and not use a similar phrase for those resisting the South African government? And secondly, why was the State Department hesitant, reluctant, or negative about the presence of a young woman from South Africa who came here for asylum? Yes.
Well, in the South African case, our position is that dialogue has to be begun with the people who are opposed to the system within South Africa. Now, some of those people don't live in South Africa. Members of the African National Congress, for example, are exiles who've lived outside South Africa for many years. But we believe that that dialogue should take place. We believe that the ANC is one party that's got to be brought into the equation. We were heartened to see that some businessmen from South Africa went to Zambia in the last 10 days and had discussions with these members of the ANC. So we characterize them as people who have a legitimate voice and have to be dealt with. On the second question of the woman at Morgan State, I'd have to look into that. I'd be happy to take her name, but I just don't know the details of the case.
How do you reconcile constructive engagement as a policy with, one, the inevitability of success of the majority in gaining power in South Africa, and how do you reconcile it with Secretary of Schultz's statement today that he absolutely opposed apartheid? And then finally, what do you think will be the feelings of the black majority in the future once they have control of South Africa, given this earlier American policy of constructive engagement?
I guess if the gentleman had been present during my remarks, he would know that certainly throughout my remarks I thought that I was laying out how we saw our present policies moving ahead toward exactly what we agreed to, and certainly what the Secretary said today, that apartheid has to be dismantled. There's no question in anybody's mind that black South Africans are going to prevail, that they are going to have a political voice in South Africa. The question is, how is that transition going to occur? And the question is, what is the United States going to do to help that process along, to speed it, and to try to see that it is less bloody than it has to be? That's the question. The third question is, what is,
The last question was, what is going to be the feeling of the black majority toward the United States down the road when they have power in South Africa?
I think this is a very good question, and I'm not sure that I could answer it. I would like to see that we would have been viewed historically as working for the same objectives that they are. But I think that this depends on what happens between now and that date and what kind of a society emerges in South Africa. If it turns out to be a relatively peaceful transition where the various communities in South Africa can live together peacefully, I think that will be fine. If it turns out to be only possible after a bloodbath and they tear that country apart and destroy what there is today in order to build something new, then I think that will be unfortunate, and I don't think that we will be seen to have been on the right side of history. I really hope the latter does not come about.
Is there any material which we have to import from South Africa which is critical to our national security?
South Africa is a very rich country with a lot of raw materials, and we import a good percentage of our requirements from South Africa. For example, chromium is 44%, ferrochromium 44%, diamonds, industrial diamonds, for example, 67%, gold 13%, feldspar 29%, manganese 33%, platinum 67%. We need these minerals. Some of them can be substituted. Some of them we can buy from other places. But right now, those are the percentages, and they're stark. But it seems to us the best solution over the long term to assure continued supply of minerals is to bring peace and stability to that region. If, in a worst-case scenario, it happened that a government in South Africa took over which was hostile to the United States, probably they would still have to sell to those that have traditionally purchased minerals from there. But, well, I might cite the case of Angola, for example. In Angola, as you all know, Gulf Oil is still operating 10 years after independence, even though we don't have any American embassy in Luanda. We don't have relations with the MPLA government. Gulf Oil continues to supply most of the foreign exchange requirements for the Angolan government, and the American oil installations in Angola are protected by Cuban soldiers.
Yes, sir. There are two questions. Why does the State Department, and a lot of people for that matter, shy away from being positive about UNITA? Secondly, you referred to the question of dealing with those who really represented the black majority. How do you identify those who really do, in fact, represent the black majority?
Well, in your first question, that is a very good question, and it's very difficult to answer, but it does afford me ammunition to talk about the complexity of the politics in Southern Africa. We have a Marxist government in Angola. We have a Marxist government in Mozambique. The Marxist government's president from Mozambique just sat at the table with our president for 2 hours the other day on an official state visit to the United States. There is a capitalist, anti-Marxist government or insurrectionist movement in Mozambique called Renamo, which is fighting for Limo, and we are not supporting that. In Angola, the Marxist MPLA government is being fought by a pro-Western, Jonas Savimbi-led, capitalist-sounding insurrectionist movement, and we are not supporting that. It's complex. And I guess one could say the reason we have not supported UNITA all these these years is because we've had the Clark Amendment, which has prohibited any assistance to any forces opposing the government in Angola. Well, that's been repealed, so the wraps are off. So as this gentleman intimated, maybe we could be, but we aren't. I am one of many who study this issue. We think so far that it's in U.S. foreign policy's better interests that we not support those and instead deal with the governments in power. And neither of those governments is elected, by the way. But we have had very fruitful and positive discussions with the Angolans over the possible exit of the Cubans. These discussions have taken place over the last 2 years in many places in Europe, in Luanda, in Saul Island, Cape Verde, and they're positive. But we have not been able to see fit to establish diplomatic relations with that government yet. On the second question, who are the real black leaders in South Africa? There's certainly no unanimity among the blacks in South Africa. Gatsha Buthelezi, Chief Gatsha Buthelezi of the Zulu tribe is an ardent oppositionist to the government, an effective, articulate spokesman who speaks out on the grievances of the unenfranchised in South Africa. As leader of the largest grouping, he has to be reckoned with as a leader. Most observers think that his influence outside of the Natal area or the KwaZulu homeland area is not as strong as it might be. Bishop Tutu. Here we have a Nobel laureate. Bishop Tutu is a voice for moderation, for religion, for nonviolent, if possible, change within South Africa. When you elevate someone to the status of Lech Walesa, he becomes a national hero in the United States and internationally. You have to listen to what he says. He's important. Dr. Ntata Motlana, former head of the Committee of 10 in Soweto, a very articulate man who finally got a passport to get out of South Africa. They wanted to give him a Bophuthatswana passport, a place he'd never lived. He said, forget it. The South African government finally gave him a passport 2 months ago to visit outside South Africa. It was his first trip ever. He's a man about 57. He came to the United States, met Vice President Bush, met Dr. Crocker, traveled around the United States for 30 days. I hope learned a great deal here and expressed his misgivings about U.S. policy in South Africa. He is a very effective spokesman who represents a certain constituency. I wouldn't speak for my government on this, but I'll speak personally, and that is, as far as I'm concerned, there is one man in South Africa who enjoys more esteem among the black population than any other, and that's Nelson Mandela. And we have said repeatedly, dialogue with the legitimate black leaders is necessary, and we have suggested to the South Africans that he be released and the discussions begin with him.
The question is, you said that American leverage is minor or small in South Africa. Why bother signaling at all if your leverage is very small? By the way, the questioner, I believe, is with the Nigerian news service. Is that correct?
I'm the editor of the Features Desk, News Agency of Nigeria.
She's the editor of the News Agency of Nigeria. Is that correct?
Features Desk.
Features list. Thank you.
While I said our leverage is small, I never said that it was non-existent. And I suppose it's somewhat like the E.F. Hutton ad. When we talk, I have a hunch that they listen.
Would you comment on any further measures beyond those already taken by the United States which it might take if the present ones don't work? Is that a correct reading of your question?
Yes. And when?
How quickly?
A lot of people think that conducting diplomacy is like putting a coin in a machine and expecting to get your bottle of soda pop right afterwards. It's not that way. Things take a long time. One of the reasons for the executive order was that it did not pin us down to certain time frames, that if they don't do this in 12 months, we're going to do this. If they don't do this, we're going to do this. We think that diplomacy is a little more complicated than that, and we think that rather than have legislation which has to be undone if they do this, it's better to do something by executive order which gives the administration the flexibility to conduct the foreign policy. In terms of what we would do if they don't do this, one of the things that you should never do in diplomacy is telegraph your punches ahead of time. And we would like to keep an air of expectancy on the part of the South Africans about what might happen if they do not see the necessity of reform. And I must say, diplomacy really is trying to convince others that you think, and they should think, it's in their self-interest to do what you think they ought to do. And I think that's what constructive engagement is. It is really the exercising of diplomacy to try to gain ends which you're convinced are in their best interest to resolve problems as peacefully as possible.
Would you comment upon the difficulty of overcoming tribal rivalries?
Well, anybody who knows anything about South Africa knows that ethnicity is very important there. Certain amount of suspicion about the Zulus because they have always had the reputation of being the most assertive, perhaps, of the groups there. But I think, from my own experience of living there, for example, Soweto is a very good test case. Soweto, as you probably know, is the huge, sprawling black township just to the southwest of Johannesburg, where probably 1.5 million occupants live legally and another 500,000 live illegally. Soweto is a melting pot for all of South Africa. Now, the South African government's policy has always been to try to stress the ethnicity factor and say that these tribes couldn't get along together. And in fact, Soweto at one time had the Pedis living in one place and the Zulus living in another area and the Xhosas in another and the Tswanas in another, and they had people live in various places. But Soweto's been in existence now for probably 3 generations. There's a lot of intermarriage. These are black citizens who've had educations, who have married between the tribes. In fact, there's even a patois in the township, which is a kind of mixture of Zulu and all the languages, including Xhosa, because Xhosa is the most poetic of the languages, I'm told, in Southern Africa, and English, and Afrikaans words in it. And this is the language that is spoken among everybody there, and everybody seems to get along fairly well, and certainly ethnicity in this modern cosmopolitan city is not stressed at all. So I think that we have to pay, or everybody has to pay attention to that factor, but I don't think it should be over-exaggerated. The question was if we treat South Africa not in black and white, but as a patient, and the United States, I assume because we are a superpower, we are the doctor, we should deal with the patient, or else the patient should find a new doctor. I think maybe that's it. The thing that bothers me about the analogy of the doctor and the patient is that a lot of people in the whole world think the United States can go in there and solve their problems. I have lived on 4 continents outside this one, and I have never met yet another society that doesn't look at the United States and they think if this country can put a man on the moon and it can build a transistor watch that sells for $8, it keeps perfect time, this country can do anything. Our power is continually exaggerated. And what we have aimed to do in South Africa, because we are a superpower, because we have an integrated society in our own country, and we have to be concerned about racism elsewhere, We have tried to be available to help. We have tried to stimulate dialogue. We have tried to use our good offices for this in South Africa. We have not said, listen, we think that you ought to have the same kind of situation that we have in the United States. You ought to have a three-chamber government. You ought to have separation of powers. You ought to adopt our Constitution. That is something we have not done. Because the problems in South Africa have to be resolved by South Africans, by everybody who lives there. And the United States can help, but we cannot do it. And we will not put ourselves in a position of prescribing a formula for them to solve their problems. I have said nothing about abolition of the past laws and restoration of citizenship. I think there's been very little in the press about this because these are announcements of government's intentions which are not in effect yet, and I think we usually wait to see them implemented before we pronounce ourselves. But certainly, if this goes through, restoring citizenship to everybody in South Africa means that a pillar of the apartheid system, in other words, the homelands policy, reserving 13% of the land area of South Africa for some 80% of the population, this has been scrapped. If that occurs, that this has been scrapped, we will consider that a very positive announcement and a positive step forward. With the pass laws, the necessity of black South Africans having a pass which prescribes where they may be at any time and where they may work, this is one of the most odious examples of the apartheid system. If they are abolished, we also would think that's an important step. But really, it's not what the United States thinks, it's not what the Americans think, it's what the South Africans think. And I think that the South African government ought to consult with the people in that country as to what they think is important, rather than have us thousands of miles away say, well, gee, that's a good idea, or we think that's terrible.
Would you expand on the instructions given to our ambassador as he returns to South Africa?
Ambassador Nicol went back to South Africa with very clear instructions from the president. Obviously, I didn't read the letter, and I guess it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about what's in the letter, but he carried a letter from President Reagan to President Botha. But it's very clear from the public statements, it's very clear from the attitudes within the American mission in South Africa that there is a change of style. We feel we have not done an adequate job of talking about our policy, talking about our policy objectives, and talking about our strategy, and communicating with all the communities in South Africa. Our ambassador has made it clear from the very moment he stepped off the plane that in the United States we believe strongly that the time for talking is over and the time for action is upon us, and that it is extremely important that the South Africans understand that signal. And it's important that all South Africans understand what we are trying to do and the tactics that we have adopted to try to get from A to B.
Councilor Jacobson, we thank you very much for your straightforward and full explanations. Thank you.
I hope it was